Professor Benedikt Hensel of the Karl von Ossietzky Universität in Oldenburg. Professor Hensel is full professor of Hebrew Bible at the institute that I just mentioned, and between 2019 and 2021 he held position as interim professor of Hebrew Bible and Biblical Archaeology at the Universities of Mainz and Zurich. He holds a PhD and habilitation in Hebrew Bible Studies and Archaeology from the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz. He is specialized in the religious history, archaeology, and literary history of Israel, Judea, and Transjordan. His main fields of work are related to the Persian and early Hellenistic periods, as well as the Neo-Assyrian period. He conducted research on the ancient Samaritans and on the Pentateuchal traditions and their historical backgrounds. He's been a visiting scholar at the University of Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Montpellier. Professor Hensel, please.
So thank you very much for having me here, Gad. I was very delighted to got your invitation for this marvelous conference. And I'm also very happy for all of you for our discussions we have. We have this very seldom in conferences that there are real discussions and thinking with the speakers are happening. And I realized that during the 3 days now, we are developing our own ideas, shaping our topics as we hear the talks. Now, we have gone a long way now from Elephantine to Judah to Samaria, and now we will later we will be heading to Babylonia. And I wanted to take the opportunity to somehow focus or spotlight on a much smaller territory that is often overlooked for the question of Yahwistic identities or activities. And it's somehow only mentioned in passing, for example, this Ostrakon mentioning the Bet Yahu, so the temple of Yahu. But I think personally there's more to it. And I stumbled on Idumea when I was doing research on the Jacob cycle, when I realized there are later additions to this cycle dating to the Persian period. And I somehow discovered not only the imagination of Israel, Jacob is somehow changing in the Persian period, but it's also the reflection of Edom is somehow resonating, possibly a Persian background. And then I started delving into this Idumean section. So what I want to do today with you is to jump into Idumea, this territory or province, and then go just like analyze the material evidence. And I have to say, of course, it's not as much evidence as we have in Elephantine and Samaria, but I think it's worthwhile thinking and to add this perspective into our whole aspect of Yahwistic diversity. Okay, let's start. Edom was the last of the small Levantine kingdoms to fall to the Neo-Babylonians, probably in connection with Nabonidus' 552 campaign to Timar in Arabia. And Idumea is part of its twofold after story, which extends the so far often overlooked traditional Edomite Transjordanian territory, but also to the Idumean territory. The earliest references to Idumea as an administrative unit can be found in the Zenon papyri from Cairo dating to 259 BCE. However, one may conclude from the official administrative Aramaic ostraka found or dated to the 4th century that the province of Idumea had probably already been established in the late Persian period. So the territory of Idumea included all the areas of the Beersheba-Arad Valley, the southern Shevalan, the southern Judean hills, that is territory that in the 8th, 7th centuries had primarily been inhabited by Judeans. And the exact course of the northern border is, of course, as mentioned by Odette, for example, yesterday, is still a matter of debate. So regarding the identity of inhabitants of this region, the most widely held opinion is that during the later stages of the Iron Age, the Edomites had invaded somehow the territory of southern Judah, establishing a presence in the eastern Negev. And as the kingdom of Judah fell, the Edomites took over its southern regions. And the former Edomite kingdom east of the Arabah became part of Arabia after the Neo-Babylonian conquest of the region. Under this reconstruction, the original Edomite territory fell under the control of the Proto-Arabian tribes known as the Kedarites, who were later replaced by the Nabateans. And this very briefly explains why in most of the academic debates from the, let's say, 20th century on Idumea, its people were simply identified as Edomites or Edomite Arabs. In an impactful study published in 1960, Avi Yonah summarized what was by then the more general view, and you can see the citation there. I read it. South of Judah was the province of Idumea, inhabited by Edomite Arabs who moved there after the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. It included all southern Judah from Bet-Sur to Beersheba, except for the coastal plain, and in its capital may have been Lachish, Mareshah, or even Hebron, the ancient capital of Judah. Since then, of course, the perception of Idumean culture has undergone significant changes. It is, for example, absolutely evident that the Edomites cannot simply be considered as Proto-Arabian cultures or Proto-Arabian tribes. Regarding the society and individuals living in the Idumea, the past decade has seen some fine pioneering groundwork to take different or more differentiating look on the identity of Idumea, and I cannot recall all this literature. I will limit myself to a few examples later during the paper. Now, what has become clear is that ethnic boundaries seem to have been very, very fluid in this region, as we have heard in the paper like 2 days ago. This region, over the several centuries, only a minority of persons, for example, maintained their progenitor's ethnic onomastica. The various findings testify more to a mixture of certain cultural and religious traits or a set of cultural, let's say, options, for example, Greek, Phoenician, Edomite, Kedarite, or Proto-Arabic, Nabatean, Southern Arabian, and Judean. And since many questions are here still unsolved, I propose to take seriously both this cultural fluidity in this region and its territorial status as Idumea. And for the paper now, I will speak more generally about Idumean identity, or Idumeans as the inhabitants of the territory or even province Idumea in general. And this is also the path we went, Diana, Ehud Ben Zvi, and I, when we designed this recently published volume on Edom and Idumea in the Persian period, to decide to call all these individuals Idumeans. And this is opposed to a recent research where it seems like they are using the term Idumeans, but they mean Edomite, and they set it in opposition to Arabic parts of the culture, Proto-Arabic, Nabatean parts, Judean parts. So, but we decided to somehow include all of this Idumean, like we would say, Judean province has Judean individuals and Samaria has Samarian inhabitants. And this term Idumeans avoids somehow the suggestion of clearly distinguishable, ethnical, identifiable groups of peoples, let's say the Arabs, the Edomites, or the Judeans, etc., living side by side in a Persian period province of Idumea. And this is clearly intended to function as a preliminary terminology for me until detailed studies in the future allow a more differentiating view on this question of ethnic identity or even nationality. There are still many cultural phenomena that remain unclear to this day. So the material findings from Idumea bring about their own plethora of questions, such as what of these Idumeans themselves, who lived there for over 2 centuries in what had been southern Judah, without any known political, cultural, or religious organization, Did they identify themselves as Idumeans in their own right, or did they instead consider themselves as refugees from, for example, Old Edom? Did they think of themselves as natives, or can we speak or think them in terms of ethnicity in general? Is there cultural continuity from the Iron Age Edomites to the people living west of the Arabah in the Persian and Hellenistic periods? And what about the Kedarites and other Arab groups who lived in this area? And what about these Judeans whose land now belonged to the entity of Idumeans, of Idumea? And given the time constraints, of course, this paper will provide an overview of the evidence supporting, and I will now specifically focusing on what I call Yahwistic activities or Yahwistic identity markers or groups in the larger context of the Idumean society in order to address, of course, the question of Idumean Yahwism in the title. The evidence will also provide a more nuanced understanding of the associated ethnic, cultural, or religious historical context which research on Idumea in the Persian period is currently in dire need of. This is the way I will go with you. The presentation only addresses a few key aspects of my larger argument, as it is not possible to cover all the material evidence. And in the final part, you see here, it's the fifth part of my paper. I will also provide a certain perspective of re-evaluating certain biblical traditions that, in my view, might reflect these Persian period realities of Idumean Yahwistic activities in the region. I start with my first point on a very simple question where I have no solution for, but it's important to have this question. So the first question is, what evidence do we have about Judeans or Yahwists or Yahwistic activity in Idumea? So the evidence that current research is primarily and almost exclusively referring to in this regard is the onomasticon from the epigraphic material. And we learned this yesterday and the day before. It's very important material. Fortunately, the past several decades have uncovered quite a lot of such material from Lachish, Arad, Beersheba, Marisha, Makeda, and several other sites, and approximately 2,000 such items have so far been uncovered. Most comprise Aramaic language ostraka, and some of them, these have been found in archaeological excavations, but we have to say most of them are unprovenanced. And Bezalel Porten, who is here, and he gave us a talk yesterday already about on the material, but also Ada Yardeni, have done a marvelous job in editing and publishing these ostraka in a well-received critical edition. Yet, as up until now, there are still several ostraka unpublished, and it would be impossible to attempt for me a systematic survey. However, given the information that is available, it is already possible to make some useful comments on this material from the various analysis of the epigraphic material. And you can see here one as one example. And you do not have to read everything. It's just that you get a feeling, an impression about the ciphers, the percentages. There's a high percentage, about 30%, that have linguistic markers that point to a sort of Arabian background of these people, and about 25% that have Edomite names, with the next largest specific group having Aramaic or Judahite markers. In the other paper we heard 2 days ago, it was subsumed, and maybe this is the better category under the label of Canaanite features. So I have to think about it, but this is how it's usually done in the different papers on identity in Idumea. When theophoric elements are listed, we find that Kos, the Edomite main deity, is the most common deity, followed by El, Baal, Yahu, and a handful others. And assuming that there is some correspondence, although not one by one, of course, between language, worship of national deities, and identity, we can see that the large segment of population was of Arabian descent, maybe almost as many were of somehow have an Idumite background, and a minority consisted of what I now call Judahites or others. And since Aramaic was the lingua franca in this time, so Aramaic names do not necessarily signify a specific identity. As such, at least by the 4th century BCE, where these ostraka are dating in, worshippers of Kos formed a clear majority, with Yahweh worshippers at under 4%. And the distribution of those names, however, is not even in the material. As emphasized by Nave, for example, at Arad, most of the officers of the fortress seem to have had Hebrew or, let's say, Yahwistic names, while most of the people to whom the supplies were given had Arabic names. Kos names were a minority here, and following this, as the Eshel, for example, has speculated, I have to say, in her terms, that Jews made up a significant part of the troops command by the Kedarites in the area. And I will come back to the terminology questions of Jews later in this paper. So the onomasticon of the ostraka found at Beersheba, on the other hand, is different. Of the tax-paying farmers listed there, approximately a third have clearly Arabic names. Another third included the element of Kos, and most of the rest have general features. And Ian Stern, who published an article in our volume on Idumea, he recently analyzed the known onomasticon without limiting the criteria for Judean ethnic markers to theophoric elements and also widening the perspective to the Hellenistic period. He concluded that at least maybe 10% of the names were what he calls of Yahudite origins. So the discussion on the Judean groups in Idumea usually breaks off exactly at this point. So you get these numbers, these tables, the percentages, and comprising in the range of 4 to 10%, depending on the category you apply, the population. These also do not seem to be of particular strong represented there in Idumea. But, and I will demonstrate this in more detail later, one has to look at the, let's say, wider picture here, in which context these names appear, what cultural factors are involved. And this links back to the comments made at the beginning that in Idumea, cultural markers are very flexible and fluid. This also brings me to a methodological problem here that I'm quite fundamental critical of in the discussion of the onomastic evidence, which is that of unambiguous ethnic and cultural attributions. The criteria of researchers are by no means clearly defined by the authors of different studies. So in the discussion, one finds terms, if referring to, let's say, Yahwistic individuals or names, they find terms with certain religious or national implications, like the following are all quotations now, like Jews or Jewish individuals or Yehudites or Judahites or Judeans or even Jewish communities, all suggesting somehow their Judean origins of those people living there. And others offer a more linguistically appropriate view. We find the terms individuals, and this is a quotation, of West Semitic or Hebrew origins, but then also referring to the same data set, national or ethnical attributions are applied, like individuals of Israelite origin or individuals of biblical origins. So yesterday we learned from Reinhard Kratze, what would this mean in this context if we are looking at the onomastic evidence? These different and somehow imprecise terminologies blur the effectiveness of these categories, of course, and again, it is somehow suggested by all these categories that we would find clearly distinguishable ethnical groups in the evidence, which I think is not the case in Idumea. As I said, the findings are more complex, and I will now go through a few aspects of and a few ideas and also questions I have. this is part of what Basically important yesterday presented to us. We are now talking about this very famous clan of Yehukal. So in the terms of the context of these Yahwistic individuals, the clan lists of the Idumean Ostraka are very interesting and have been pertinently studied by Basically important, but also other Yardenian, also André Lemaire, among others. It has been observed that many of the individuals mentioned in the Ostraka are defined by their connection to a family, to a clan, or to a tribe. Some 230 individuals in the Idumean corpus have been identified by affiliation to a clan, either through such constructs as the son of, or from the sons of, or from the house of, or similar. And this is, if you compare this with biblical literature and extra-biblical literature, this is a very common designation. We find this in the Aramean, the sons of Gush, or the house of Gush, this shift like house and sons from the Sephireh inscription, for example. And 5 major clans have emerged in our documents. Among those clans, one is the so-called Yehukal clan, as mentioned by Bezalel yesterday. And this individual, Yehukal, bears a name with certain biblical association, as it is called, and it is identified as a Judahite, and yesterday Bezalel used the term Jewish progenitor of the clan. Yet all of his sons, and this was also pointed out yesterday, seem to have non-Judahite names, some containing the Idumean theophoric element cause, or most of them actually. In this review of the evidence, again, Ian Stern determines this Yehukal clan and this person behind it, Yehukal, as a Judahite patriarch, but that his offspring, and I quote, either choose to identify with or included a variety of different ethnic groups and identities into his clan. Again here, even within the idea of a melange of ethnic groups, a clear concept of ethnicity of the individuals in question is suggested. And I would construe it differently. There is the clear possibility that the name bearers or name givers did not really differentiate between Yahweh, Yahu, and Kos, and that both were understood in their own perception, or the perception from outside, as representations of their main deity. This immediately raises the question of the cultural proximity of Kos and Yahweh during the Iron Age, of course, and with good reasons, because after all it is conspicuous that Kos is one of the few non-Israelite deities that is not represented negatively in the biblical traditions. And in addition, there are the religious historical considerations of a common origins of Yahweh, Yahu, and Kos as better deities, and as well as the affinity of Yahweh from the origins to Edom, as is could be interpreted from the findings of Kuntilit ad Rut. So this also means that the individuals of clan Yehukal may have understood themselves as Yahwehs according to their main clan leader, despite the course-containing names of the individuals. Yahwistic identity is not limited to Yahwistic or biblical names alone. This is the main point I want to make. We have to set this in the context of this multi-ethnic or fluid identity within this very region. And I give you another example, but for this I have to move slightly later in time into the Hellenistic period, but I think this gives the overall picture for Yahwistic identity in Idumea. The second example also suggests this, what I think is a religious or cultural permeability of the imagination of God, and thus of Yahwistic religious options. The prosopography of the so-called Sidonian tomb at the Hellenistic site of Maresha. And you can see the inscription here that is found in a tomb. They were buried together. An individual with a Greek name, Apollophanes, is mentioned on an inscription in this very tomb, and he was the son of Sasmeus. Here's the site of, So this is the inscription you have to go with. Here's a son called Sasmeus, identified as a Semitic name, and his sister was named Sabo, a name that has been assumed to be either Idumean, whatever this may mean in this context. So should it be an Idumite name, question mark, or Palmyrene name, or Nabatean name? Another inscription from this tomb mentioned a Barbas in the family tree, which is probably a Judahite or Yahwistic name. This Barbas was the son of a Nathanos, which obviously integrates the theophoric elements of the old Edomite main deity in this family tree. The situation in the tomb has been, in the past, often been labeled or been discussed within the sphere of syncretism, but I would strongly refrain from such pretentious designation. In more neutral terms, the inscriptions witness to a clear intermixing of ethnic and cultural traits in one family tomb. And a Kos Natan mentioned there could also be understood from the outside or even from the inside from this family as a Yehu Natan and vice versa. And it is not possible at this point to determine whether a fluidity between Kos and Yahweh existed, but at the time, the evidence does not preclude such a conclusion. And it appears to me that the possibility that Yahwistic identity participates in this broader cultural or religious fluidity in the region should be taken very seriously. And doing so would mean that Yahwistic identity becomes part of a much broader phenomenon, a phenomenon in which, I call it now Idumean Yahwism, is distinct from other Yahwisms, as we know from Yehud, from Sumeria in this period. Yet this version of Yahwism in the region of Idumea perfectly fits our understanding of Yahwism in the Persian period more in general, and what I have termed Yahwistic diversity, and I'm well aware of the whole problematics of the terminology, calling it Yahwistic or Yahwism instead of Judaism, and Conrad pointed all the problems out yesterday perfectly, but I still think this is the most neutral term we can use for this phenomenon, but of course we can discuss this. So we have different forms of Judaism, Yehud, Samaria, and Egypt, Babylonia, even Transjordan, and then in Idumea, they have a sort of fluid understanding of what Yahwism or a group Yahwism is in this period. And in particular, this means that monotheistic Yahwism was not the only possible form of Yahwism during this period, and I will return on this note later in a minute. This is a very short part only, and we'll skip most of it. But we have, Mauritius is a very international city dated to the Hellenistic period, and in a minute I will come back to the Persian period. But I think this is very important to note, that we find this mixture, the mixture of cultural traits in this city, Hellenized city of Mauritius. We have a lot of theophoric elements there. We have populations is composed by Nabateans, Phoenicians, Edomites, Judeans, and others. What is interesting to me, that within this context of Idumea and in the pre-Maccabean settlement of Mauritius, there's a strong evidence of circumcision, but also of pre-Maccabean ritual purification bath, of holy vessels appearing to reflect a sort of later, of course, then Mishnaic rules according to the excavator Aaron Cloner, and often aniconic divine representations and of burial practices using bone collections. Now, I'm a little bit hesitant. I think Cloner is a little bit too optimistic in identifying this like an early pre-Jewish features here. But be this as it may, there's another set of data I find very interesting that has just been published in the final report. It's a fairly exceptional find or data set. That is the discovery of 18 models of phalloi in several of the subterranean complexes. Also, the phalloi itself are well known from Egyptian context, the surprising element here that all those fallow were circumcised. And all of the fallow were carved from local chalk in Mareshah. And according to Adi Ehrlich, the fallow were probably connected to the cult of Dionysius as well as to Hermes and had probably an apotropic function. And it is important, and we'll emphasize this here, that what one might call Jewish religious cultural traits in Mareshah here predate the conquest of John Hyrcanus and the forced conversion of Idumeans that came with it, and are in the context, of course, not yet, and this is very important, they are not yet exclusively Jewish, or in my terms, Yahwistic. The people in Mareshah share a certain set of cultural traits which effectively has been a mixture of different and also Yahwistic options. In later periods, those became solid identification markers for Jewish identity, but not, of course, before the Maccabean period. And one can therefore speak here with good reasons for a fusion of traditions in Mareshah, which fits the multi- and transcultural setting in the province of Idumea as such. I come to my last element of the evaluating the material evidence, what I called the more direct indications of Yahwism in Idumea. And finally, we have arrived at this very famous ostrakon that is here and there mentioned, but as I said, only in passing. So in 2002, André Lemaire published this publicon, ostrakon, dating to the 4th century BCE, with a land register of sorts mentioning a temple, a Bet Yahu, or house of Yahoo. The transcription here drawn is from his edition from 2015. To state this beforehand, the problems with this ostrakon are very well known. It is, like most of the Idumean ostraka, unprovenanced. We should therefore be careful in granting too much weight and putting too much argumentative force on this ostrakon. But, of course, it fits somehow very neatly into the Yahwistic horizon of Idumea, and I have just sketched out. As you can see here on this slide, except for a few uncertain readings and words at the beginning of line 3 and 4, and at the end of line 5, the onomasticon, the ostrakon is completely readable. In particular, the reading of Bet Yahu is unquestionable. And additionally, there is the much debated solar shrine at Lachish, and I will only touch this whole discussion, but I think it has to be discussed here within Yahwism in Idumea. Based on the associated pottery, the original excavation report dated the buildings probably constructed to the period after 586 BCE, and this assumption has found wide acceptance. Yet, within recent discussion, a secure Hellenistic dating seems equally plausible, as recently suggested and pointed out by Alexander van Talkin and Oriental. And Yochanan Acharoni had suggested that the solar shrine served as a Yahwistic cult from the nearby rural or possibly urban inhabitants. And found on the site was also a small incense altar from the Persian period, incised with a possible Yahwistic name on it, Machalya. So, but the reading is very, very unclear, so this is very much a matter of debate. I've now arrived at the final aspect of my paper. I want to look at the possibility if there might be a reflection of those realities, those multicultural realities in certain biblical tradition, which I think is the case. And what intrigues me here is the fact that in certain Persian period texts or redactions or traditions, the relationship of Edom and Israel is portrayed in a quite positive manner. And this is remarkably, and so I will emphasize this, since the dominant post-exilic tradition on Edom especially in the prophetic literature, seems to be effectively shaped by a so-called proverbial hatred on Edom, if you compare it, for example, to Obadiah, but also Psalm 137. And this hatred has often been associated with the proposed historical backstabbing of Judah by the Edomites at the time of the fall of the Judahite monarchy, and their part in the destruction of Jerusalem and in this temple. And this has frequently and traditionally been interpreted to mean that this specific perception, so this very negative perception of Edom, was also the only post-exilic perception of Edom, that texts depicting Edom in a positive manner was in a way unthinkable. But I think, and still, what I want to say is, of course, this negative image is on the surface, and this is the main tradition we have in the second period, temple period text, but there are different voices. And I will now come to the different voices, and I selected 2 examples. The first one you can see for a while now here is comes from the book of Chronicles. It's a very obvious case here, to me at least, that the fluidity of genealogical cultural traits within these genealogies in the Chronicles is somehow displayed. Chronicles presents genealogical lists linking Judean and Edomite families or clans through the reception of eponymous ancestors and descendants from Esaf, Edom, and their receptions of the Edomite genealogy from Genesis 36. And the most striking case you can see here on the slide is the case of the genealogical overlap that occurs with regard to Esau's grandson Kenaz, the son of Eliphaz, in Genesis 36, verse 11. And this name also appears as one of the sons of Esau in Genesis 36, 15 and 42, and these Kenizzites appear in the Edomite genealogy in 1 Chronicles 1, 35 to 45, as well in the more Judahite genealogy in 1 Chronicles 4. There are more cases I listed here, and if we would have more time, we could go into more detail here. But I think the case is clear. Whoever wrote the Chronicles borrowed somehow from the repertoire from Genesis 36 the Edomite names and integrated there in a sort of mishmash from Edomite and Judean names. And this has, at least to my perception, has no historical, very direct historical grounds, as was proposed to me by Yiga Levin, for example, is like saying, yes, in the Persian period, this was everyone had Idumean name or the Edomite names in Idumea. I think this is wrong. This, like all genealogies, is ideology or theology. In the genealogische Vorhalle of Chronicles, somehow the sphere of Edomites, and I think this means people from Idumea, or certain groups from Idumea, the Yahwists from Idumea, are somehow integrated into the perception of Israel like it is sketched out by the chroniclers. Yeah? So it is somehow integrated into biblical Israel in the version of Chronicles. And another example comes from Deuteronomy. The so-called Kahal law in Deuteronomy 23 categorically excludes Moab and Ammon from the community of Israel, but in verses 8 to 9 it mentions the inclusion of Edom and Egypt to the very same Kahal. So it reads here, and you can read it with me, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. Children born to them in the 3rd generation may enter the assembly of Adonai." So for a literary historical reason, there's a broad consensus among scholars that the passages belong to the Persian period redactional layers of Deuteronomy, and Eckhart Otto, maybe you know this, thinks that it's even post-Deuteronomistic, but still it would belong to the Persian period. And I spoke to Thomas Römer, and he has a similar opinion on dating this particular passage. But Up until now, it could not be explained what would be the topographical, or let's say the social political implications or the background of this Kahal law. It certainly fits into the more general historical background of the Persian period, as Thomas Wömer pointed out, where the idea of developing or maybe discussing biblical Israel or Israelite identity is quite dominant amongst several scribal groups. And one might point here, for example, to an ideology of segregation that excludes Ammonites and excludes Moabites in the Second Temple community of Jerusalem, which at the same or roughly the same time is somehow referenced to in Nehemiah 13. But the specific case I want to stress here in the case of Edom is that it possibly reflects Idumean realities and promotes an integration of Edom. This means, in my perception, Idumean Yahwists into their conception, means their conception of Israel put forward by these reductionists from Deuteronomy. So the prevailing idea here is that of the brotherhood of Israel and Edom. No? You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. Yet, this is not simple genealogical allocation, but rather an integration of the Persian period's Edom, that is Idumea, into the redactor's vision of biblical Israel. So the integration formula at the end, the Aufnahmeformel, states this very clearly. Edomites and Egyptians may enter the assembly of Adonai. And I come now to my conclusion. There would be more evidence to present, but within the limitations of the time now, I will come to the initial question: was there an Idumean Yahwism? And here one must, of course, differentiate. The first answer is the very obvious no, because one cannot assume a homogeneous faith group or religious group on the basis of these findings. Where should this have had their religious center? How were they organized, if at all? Nevertheless, as shown, there are still many ambiguities in the evaluation of the material findings. Many of the individuals with, in my terms, Yahwistic cultural traits in the background may, in absolute terms, be descendants of Judeans in this area from the former kingdom of Judah. The question, however, is whether those people stemming from or are being descendants from this pre-exilic period, in this post-exilic periods, define themselves in terms of this past. So should we call them ex-Judeans, or should we term them Judeans? Or should we term them, like we do with Idumean identity in the whole region and territory, just simply call them Edomite Yahwists? And so long as many of the identity issues, also in the greater Idumean regions, are still unresolved, I would prefer then to use the term Idumean Yahwism more neutrally for the phenomenon of individuals worshipping Adonai in this region. And as stated before, this Yahwism adds to my general perception of the multiple Yahwisms in the Persian period, which are characterized by regional diversification and pluriform sociological and religious forms. And to me, this Yahwism of the Persian period is primarily characterized by a set of cultural, social, and religious options that only realized their formative power by the 2nd century, or let's say the 1st century BCE. Via this long process, early Judaism emerges from this multiplicity of different Yahwisms. The different groups exist alongside each other in the previous periods, even if they display differences in detail regarding religious practices and the sociology of religion. So, for example, monotheism is a possible option during the Persian period, possibly practiced in Jerusalem and on Mount Gerizim, but it's not an exclusive option for faith in the God of Israel, as we can see in Elephantine and as we for sure can see in Idumea. And as I suggested, for the biblical evidence, there are options to be explored in which authors or redactors from these periods developed, or let's say fabricated, an understanding of Yahwistic identity or biblical Israel that would not exclude others or even less important Yahwistic groups as the Idumeans might be understood, but to somehow develop the idea to integrate them into their family concept of Israel. Yeah? In any case, the material and possibly biblical evidence of an Idumean Yahwism grants us a unique glimpse into a non-biblical, one might say, Judaism from the Persian period. As demonstrated, Idumean Yahwism is a much broader phenomenon than just the normally mentioned 4 to 10% of population in the statistics. It's widely used, and Yahwism participates, and this is my final aspect, in the phenomenon of cultural fluidity in the region, and as such is a much larger phenomenon. And there would be much more to discuss, but I will rest my case here and leave everything else to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Excuse me, do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because, how do you know whether, how can we know whether Beit Yahu is an active Yahwistic temple, shrine, or just a toponym, or referring to a ruined Yahu temple from the Judean past, Judaic past? I think this was the dominant opinion.
Yeah. Thank you very much for pointing this out.
I have more remarks, but no, it's okay.
Yeah.
Refer to me.
Thank you very much for pointing this out. I mean, this is a clear possibility. It had some reasons that I brought this Ostrakon, what is mostly mentioned in this context, I brought at the end, because I first wanted to establish the context. And I'm very much, we can only, what we see here on this Ostrakon, and maybe it's even a forgery, we don't know. So I didn't want to put so much weight in it. You're absolutely right. It could be from the former times an deranged or ruined temple of Yahoo that is mentioned there. But still, we don't know. And I will not make this a very large case like, oh, they had a temple there. I used to refer to it as an Idumean temple in the 4th century, but I, of course, agree with you. There are a lot of problems because the only mention of such a temple we have is this, and as you said, could be a ruined temple.
No, but
not active, not used by this Idumean group.
Yeah, thank you. I know that you had to mention it because in order to complete the picture.
Yeah. But I had to, huh?
Yeah, you had to, yeah. You're right.
Okay,
Baba, no. Okay.
Thank you, Benedikt, for this really enlightening and rich paper. Just one question. I always puzzle with his name, Yeukal. A lot of people take it as a Yahoo name, but from the Semitic point of view, it sounds a little bit like a back formation, as Bauer Leander already said, with biblical Yuchal, Yehuchal, from the root Yachal, and Yaktil formation. We have the same with Joseph, which sometimes in the biblical manuscript from Qumran also appear as Joseph. So is there really a Yahoo in this? And if this is Yahoo, what then does the element Kal means?
Yeah, I cannot tell you, but I've seen that Bezalel, you wanted to pose a question, so maybe he can go on this. But I'm not thinking that it's Yeho-Kal is particular a Yahoo name. It's like a biblical, reminding biblical name, something like this. But
well, Yehu-Kal appears in the Babylonian material, so it was, along with Yama, considered to be Jewish or Judean. But I would note that in all the Idumean ostrika, there is not one ostrican that is compounded with Yahoo. So the idea that Kos and Yahu are identical as Yahu and Baal in the Idumean, in the Babylonian Ostracon that we spoke about yesterday, the 3 Ostracon and the 2 Ostracon that cite Baal and Baal Sharu Utsur and Yahu Sharu Utsur. I don't think you could do that with Kos and Yahu, much as one can argue on the basis of pure analogy and wishful thinking that there is some pre-Jewish influence in Idumea before Hyrcanus. I don't think that the evidence that you brought is convincing.
So it's not convincing or is convincing? So
Not convincing.
So where should I begin? I mean, you're right with the names. We have the problem with the names, but this case with Kos, I somehow, when I wrote this paper, that I usually in the beginning I wanted to go another road, but then it appeared to me that somehow Kos must be or could be understood in this more fluid context also as a representation of Yahweh. And even if we do not have Yahu names in this very clear context, but for example, we have Hebrew names or names that could attribute it to the cultural context of Hebrews or early Judean Jewish traditions, that there are in these family trees are Kos names. And I'm hesitant to just say, okay, they married 2 Edomites in this whole region, but then I would say, okay, we have clearly the old distinctive Edomite groups here, and then their marriage into a sort of family tree. I would leave this open, and as I said, maybe wishful thinking, but Kos has some very much similarities with Yahweh, Yahu, in the larger spectrum, and why shouldn't it be possible? But then again, I hear this could be wishful thinking, but somehow I think it's not. We should not limit ourselves to just counting the possible Judean names, and that's it for this larger phenomenon.
Thank you very much for sort of pointing out how complicated this is. But I was wondering what category you're actually aiming at in terms of group identity. It sounds to me like you're somewhat conflating culture and religion and society and ethnicity, and these are all different concepts.
Yeah.
And a lot of times in biblical studies, there's this tendency to assume that there's almost the ontological reality behind ethnicity, and all ethnicity is 2 groups agree that they belong for whatever criteria happen to at this point to be relevant for making a distinction, and which from the outside may not look like a distinction. So for something like Kos, right, it may or may not be perceived by the people as a group distinctiveness, right, on an ethnic level, maybe cultic level or something. But so what level are you seeing this as a?
Well, the case I wanted to make is that I see a problem in research, that we are trying to somehow categorize very strictly in this. You have Judean groups, and this this has some implications. When I find Judean names, this has some implications that maybe all those people are ex-Judeans, and they are retrieving their identity from being once in Judah or being part of Judah, and now they are not. So this could be an implication that is true. I don't know, but for now, like we are looking now for cultural markers, let's just say or assume those are Idumeans, like I would say Sumerians, for example. I'm not looking for, or in Judah, it's often more clearer. I'm not speaking about Judeans of maybe, and for sure there were refugees from Samaria after 722, but I'm not referring to them as Samarians in Judah. They have become, over time, we can identify them as Judeans, and the more general reference I have, the more grand scope I would have here is just the territorial attribution. Judea, Yehud, so they are Yehudim in this sense. The others are part of Idumea, so I would attribute them as the first category as being from the territory of Idumea, so I call them Idumians. And then I start to think what ethnic identities those peoples might have had, but they might have attributed to, or how might they identified have them themselves. Yeah, but I think this is still a thing where we should work out more precise elements on defining identity questions. I think we too early jump into this all. Normally it's ethnic identity questions, but yeah.
Thank you for the lecture. I have 2 points, but I think because of time constraints, I will only talk about one. You were talking about Deuteronomy 23 and the Idumeans getting into the where is it? Yeah, to the Kahal Adonai, right? So you have here the Idumeans and you have here the Egyptians, and you also have the Ammonites and Moabites who are not supposed to enter, right? And that is even in 10th generation. But if it's the Persian period, one is what do you do with the Moabites who are not there anymore? Yep. So yeah, 10 generations or even more generations, if they don't exist anymore, that doesn't matter. Yep. So the whole thing it doesn't fit into the Persian period. And the Egyptians, on the other hand, what do you do with them when it's under Persian control, when it's sometimes the Persians that were enemies of the Egyptians?
Yeah, thank you very much. So the point here is that I think there's no straight historical reality behind it. Of course, Edom is gone, Moab is gone, Ammon is gone, but still those names are used, those designations, labels are used in the Persian period. And I somehow understand them in the same way I would, for example, understand how I understand the mixed marriages and how you're not supposed to marry from the nations of this and that, and then they're quoting the old peoples from Deuteronomy, which did not exist or didn't by that time not exist, that are somehow criteria or general notions. And we have to try to identify those criteria. In Edom, I think, they in this special case, they aim at this subgroup or individuals from Idumea saying, maybe you have been Judeans, you are our brothers and sisters, you belong to us. So they're making a case for Edom. And Moab and Ammon, we have to think what they would be aiming at. Maybe other groups that might or might not be, or think from themselves that they were related to this Israel in this period. Because in Nehemiah 13, it is used, this very passage, to somehow exclude Tobiah the Ammonite. Yeah? And then you see, we have not a clear ethnical demarcation line. It's Tobiah the Ammonite that is excluded from the temple. So you see here, somehow Ammon functions as a label for making groups that may or may not belong to the same group, a foreign group. I think these are more labelings than really displaying a certain actual historical reality. And I have no good answer for Egypt in this period.